should directly and explicitly build international understanding and cooperation. And the third, and in some ways my favorite, is that education should lead to the application of creative imagination and trained intelligence to the should directly and explicitly build international understanding and should directly and explicitly build international understanding and cooperation.
Tax for the general welfare. He says it explicitly. Madison says if that's the meaning of the Constitution, we don't even have a Constitution anymore. Hamilton says, watch me, I have the votes. In that structural context, you can declare the other side to be the enemy, and you can keep on working within the system. You have a cover that facilitates your continued commitment to the system, even as you're making this incredibly, I would say, overwrought political argument that the other side is outside the system. But you're signaling to everybody simultaneously that you don't really fully believe it. Tax for the general welfare. He says it explicitly. Madison says if that's the tax for the general welfare. He says it explicitly. Tax for the general welfare. He says it explicitly. Madison
upon this specific interest explicitly. However, you will not see the political establishment or mainstream media expressing this view at all to the public in its day-to-day affairs, even though Brzezinski will argue it as though it's common sense. Upon this specific interest explicitly. Upon this specific interest explicitly.
Not sure that it's a completely new idea, but we actually explicitly prove this. And is it a fast classical algorithm for combinatorial optimization? That's the third goal we could put on there. I think it was actually Eddie Farhi's suggestion that we try this, and that was a very good suggestion because it turned out that yes, it was surprisingly good. And before concluding, I should mention one last thing, that these barriers really apply to anything. Not sure that it's a completely new idea, but we actually explicitly prove this. Not sure that it's a completely new idea, but we actually explicitly prove this.
Like he was saying, this is explicitly talking about people who are consumed with lustfulness. And he just never really considered that it's possible that there are same-sex relationships that don't fit into that paradigm. Mm-hmm. I know that can sound very ignorant. I mean, in a sense, because it is ignorant of just, but it's not necessarily hateful. Like a lot of people assume that Christians who are against same-sex marriage must be like terribly bigoted, hateful people. And you can always find some examples of truly hateful. Right. Like he was saying, this is explicitly talking about people who are consumed with love. Like he was saying, this is explicitly talking about people
and you had a succession of governments explicitly devoted to the claim, we are going to modernize, and to modernize, we are going to destroy traditional society altogether. So texts like these were burned, the old temples were destroyed. It was an explicitly modernist paradigm, particularly, of course, under Mao, during the Cultural Revolution, literally these texts were too. And you had a succession of governments explicitly devoted to the claim, we too. And you had a succession of governments explicitly devoted to the claim,
no modern president would explicitly cite Theodore Roosevelt's stewardship theory of executive power. Most of them secretly practice it. So what is it? Roosevelt, in his autobiography, no modern president would explicitly cite Theodore Roosevelt's stewardship theory. No modern president would explicitly cite Theodore.
Was created and operated based explicitly on the consent of its people, and a government whose whole authority derived from that consent without hereditary rulers or orders or anything like that. Now bear in mind that building a system of government wholly on popular authority is a political heresy in the 17th. It was created and operated based explicitly on the consent of its people, and a government whose whole authority was created and operated based explicitly on the consent of its people, and a government whose whole authority derived from that consent without hereditary rulers or orders or anything. It was created and operated based explicitly on the consent of its people.
But the statute says explicitly that the only children that are eligible for this special treatment are children who have bona fide learning disabilities that does not include disabilities due to poverty or cultural or external factors implicitly. And I think it's not quite explicit, but certainly everybody has construed the statute to mean that you have to, your brain has, but the statute says explicitly, that the only